In the year 1258, a catastrophe unfolded that would forever alter the course of history. One of the world's most magnificent cities, a beacon of civilization for half a millennium, was brought to its knees. This city was Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. It wasn't just a sprawling metropolis. It was the epicenter of knowledge, culture, and power, the capital of the Abbasid. For 500 years, its libraries, universities, and palaces had drawn the greatest minds from across the known world. It was a city of unparalleled wealth, wisdom, and wonder. But in that fateful year, a storm from the east arrived, a force of nature unlike any seen before. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, stood at its gates. The story of what happened next is not merely one of conquest and destruction, though the scale of that alone is staggering. It is a more personal, more chilling tale. It's about the deliberate and systematic annihilation of a dynasty. It's the story of the Abbasid royal family and the terrifyingly symbolic fate that awaited them. What the Mongols did was not a simple act of war. It was a ritualistic dismantling of power, designed to shatter not just the bodies of the Caliph and his kin, but their very honor, their sacred status, and their place in the memory of their people. It was a fate some considered far worse than a swift death. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must first appreciate what Baghdad represented. Founded in the 8th century by Caliph al-Mansur, it was conceived as the center of the world. Its official name was Madinat al-Salam, the City of Peace. Its famed round city design was a marvel of urban planning. Within its walls, scholars translated the works of Greek philosophers. Mathematicians developed algebra, and astronomers mapped the stars with unprecedented accuracy. The House of Wisdom, its legendary library, held a collection of texts that was the envy of the world. Baghdad was the vibrant, beating heart of an empire that stretched from North Africa to the borders of India. At the head of this empire was the Caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, and the spiritual leader of the Sunni Muslim world. The Abbasid dynasty had ruled for over 5 centuries. Though their direct political power had waned over time, their symbolic authority was immense. The Caliph was a figure of supreme religious and cultural importance. His bloodline was considered sacred, his person inviolable. To harm the Caliph was not just an act of regicide. It was a profound sacrilege. By the mid-13th century, however, the Abbasid Caliphate was a shadow of its former self. The current ruler, Al-Mustasim Billah, presided over a state weakened by internal divisions and complacency. He was more interested in poetry and leisure than in statecraft or military strategy. He underestimated the Mongol threat, viewing them as distant barbarians who could be placated or ignored. He was tragically mistaken. Hulagu Khan was on a mission. His brother, the great Khan Mengi, had ordered him to expand the Mongol Empire westward, to subdue the remaining Muslim powers that had not yet submitted to Mongol rule. Hulag's army was a juggernaut, a disciplined and ruthless fighting force that had already carved a path of destruction across Persia. When Hulagu sent an ultimatum to Caliph al-Mustasim, demanding his submission, the Caliph responded with arrogance and empty threats. He reminded Hulagu of the wrath of Allah and the might of the Muslim world that would rally to his side. It was a fatal miscalculation. No one rallied. In January 1258, the Mongol siege began. Their engineers, many of them captured from conquered lands, constructed a vast array of siege engines. Catapults hurled massive rocks, and naphtha-powered projectiles set parts of the city ablaze. The Caliph's army was small and ill-prepared. The city's defenses, once formidable, had been neglected. After just a few weeks of brutal bombardment, a section of the eastern wall was breached. Panic swept through Baghdad. The Caliph, finally realizing the hopelessness of his situation, attempted to negotiate. But it was too late. Hulagu was no longer interested in submission. He wanted annihilation. On February 10th, Al-Mustasim, along with his sons and hundreds of his court officials, walked out of the city gates and surrendered unconditionally. 3 days later, the Mongol horde was unleashed upon Baghdad. What followed was a week of almost unimaginable horror. The accounts from historians of the era paint a grim picture. The city was systematically plundered and burned. Its inhabitants were slaughtered without mercy. Men, women, and children were cut down in the streets, in their homes, in their mosques. The scale of the killing was so vast that, according to some sources, the streets ran red. The city's intellectual heart was ripped out. The great house of wisdom, with its priceless collection of manuscripts on science, philosophy, and literature, was destroyed. Countless books were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said that the river ran black with the ink from the dissolving texts and red with the blood of the scholars, who were killed alongside their life's work. It was a cultural genocide, an attempt to erase centuries of knowledge and progress. The loss was incalculable and set back the intellectual development of the region for generations. But for Hulagu Khan, the physical destruction of the city was not enough. He had a specific problem to solve: what to do with the Caliph and his family. For the Mongols, the spilling of royal blood on the earth was a grave taboo. It was believed to offend the heavens and bring misfortune, a superstition they took very seriously. This wasn't about mercy. It was about cosmic order. They had faced this issue before with other conquered rulers. The solution was always the same: death without bloodshed, a method that was both ritually correct and profoundly humiliating. Caliph al-Mustasim was forced to watch the slaughter of his people and the looting of his treasury. He was interrogated by Hulagu, who mockingly asked him why he had spent his vast wealth on strengthening his army instead of hoarding it. The Caliph and his surviving sons were then subjected to the ultimate degradation. According to the most widely cited accounts, they were wrapped tightly in carpets. Then, the Mongol soldiers either trampled them to death with their horses or kicked and rolled them until they were crushed. This method fulfilled the Mongol requirement. No royal blood touched the sacred earth, but the symbolism was devastating. The Caliph, the spiritual leader of millions, was not given the dignity of a warrior's death. He was not beheaded or struck down with a sword. He was bundled up like an object, a piece of baggage, and disposed of. He was suffocated and crushed, his end ignominious and anonymous, hidden from sight within a roll of felt. His sons met the same fate. This was the complete and utter negation of his royal status. He died not as a king, but as a thing. The rest of the Abbasid family was hunted down. Hulagu wanted to ensure the dynasty was extinguished. Thousands of members of the extended royal family were executed, with only one young son reportedly being spared and sent back to Mongolia. The message was clear and brutal. The Abbasid line was finished. Their sacred authority, their 5-century legacy, was trampled into the dust, literally. The fall of Baghdad and the manner of the Caliph's death sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. The spiritual center of Sunni Islam had been extinguished. For many, it felt like the end of the world. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical destruction. The belief in the inviolability of the Caliphate was shattered forever. The Mongol Empire continued its westward push, but its advance was finally halted later that same year in Palestine at the Battle of En-Jalut by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. This victory was hugely significant. It marked the first time a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle, and it saved Egypt and North Africa from the fate of Baghdad. The Mamluks became the new protectors of what remained of Islamic power and culture in the region. Baghdad, the city of peace, lay in ruins. It would take centuries for it to recover, and it would never regain the glory of its golden age. The story of its fall is a grim reminder of the fragility of civilization, but the specific fate of its last caliph is a testament to the cold, calculated cruelty of conquest. It shows that sometimes, for an empire bent on total domination, killing a king is not enough. You must also kill the idea of the king. You must destroy the symbols of his power, desecrate his sacred status, and ensure his end is remembered not with honor, but with the chilling finality of being rolled in a carpet and crushed into oblivion. It was a death designed to erase a dynasty from the world, a terrifying final chapter for the Abbasid Caliphs. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Imagine a city that was the center of the world, a place where knowledge was more valuable than gold, where libraries stretched as far as the eye could see, and where the greatest minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of human understanding. This wasn't a fantasy. This was Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. For 500 years, under the rule of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad was a beacon of civilization. While Europe was still navigating the Dark Ages, this city was a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. Its streets were paved, illuminated at night, and filled with the aromas of spices from distant lands. Palaces with lush gardens and shimmering fountains dotted the landscape, a testament to the immense wealth and power of its rulers. The heart of it all was the House of Wisdom, a legendary library and academy that was the envy of the world. Here, scholars from every corner of the known world, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others worked side by side. They translated ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might have otherwise been lost forever. They made groundbreaking discoveries in mathematics, pioneering algebra and algorithms. They advanced medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. The numbers we use today, the very concept of zero, the foundations of modern science. So much of it can be traced back to the work done within these walls. The Caliph, the ruler of this vast empire, was more than just a political leader. He was the spiritual head of the Sunni Muslim world, a symbol of divine authority. People looked to Baghdad not just for leadership, but for guidance and inspiration. The city felt eternal, untouchable. Its circular walls, designed by its founder, were a marvel of engineering, a fortress built to withstand any siege. The Tigris River flowed through its heart, providing life and a natural defense. Generations had lived and died believing that Baghdad was indestructible, that God himself protected this jewel of a city. It had a history steeped in glory, a legacy of power that seemed unshakable. How could a city that was the very definition of civilization possibly fall? This belief, this profound sense of security, was about to be put to the ultimate test. Far to the east, a storm was gathering. A force unlike any the world had ever seen was on the move. They were the Mongols, led by the descendants of the formidable Genghis Khan. Their reputation preceded them, a tide of warriors who swept across Asia, leaving devastation in their wake. They were disciplined, ruthless, and masters of siege warfare. By the mid-13th century, their empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of the Middle East, and their gaze was now fixed on the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mongol leader, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, sent an ultimatum to the Caliph in Baghdad, al-Mustasim. The message was simple: submit to Mongol rule or face annihilation. The Caliph, insulated by centuries of Abbasid prestige and surrounded by advisors who downplayed the threat, made a fatal miscalculation. He responded with arrogance, refusing to bow to the Mongol Khan. He believed the city's walls were impenetrable. He believed the Muslim world would unite and rush to his aid. He believed in the divine protection that had guarded his city for 5 centuries. He was wrong on all counts. In the winter of 1258, a massive Mongol army, estimated to be one of the largest ever assembled, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. Ulug's forces were a marvel of military organization. They brought with them Chinese engineers skilled in building powerful siege engines, catapults, and trebuchets that could hurl massive stones, flaming projectiles, and even diseased carcasses over the city walls. The siege began. 4 days. The sky above Baghdad was dark with flying rocks and fire. The thunderous crash of projectiles smashing against the city's famed walls became the new, terrifying rhythm of daily life. The defenders fought back bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. The Caliph's army was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal conflicts and neglect. The promised reinforcements from other Muslim states never materialized. They were either too afraid of the Mongols or too caught up in their own rivalries. After less than 2 weeks of relentless bombardment, a section of the eastern wall was breached. The Mongol warriors poured into the city like a flood. What followed was a week of unimaginable horror. The city that had been a center of learning and culture was turned into a slaughterhouse. Accounts from historians, though they may vary in specific numbers, paint a gruesome picture. The streets ran red with blood. The Mongols showed no mercy, slaughtering soldiers and civilians alike, men, women, and children. The city's inhabitants, who had believed themselves safe just weeks before, were hunted down in their homes, in the mosques, and in the alleyways. The destruction was not limited to human life. The cultural treasures of Baghdad were systematically obliterated. Palaces were looted and burned to the ground. Mosques were desecrated. And most tragically, the great libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were destroyed. countless books, their accumulated knowledge of centuries were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said that the river ran black with the ink from the dissolving pages, and then red with the blood of the slaughtered scholars. The intellectual heart of the world was ripped out. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was captured. His end was as brutal as his cities. To avoid spilling royal blood directly onto the earth, a Mongol taboo, he was reportedly rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. With him died the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate. The spiritual and political symbol that had united much of the Islamic world was extinguished. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves across the globe. It marked the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age. The city that had once been the world's most vibrant center of commerce, science, and art was reduced to a smoldering ruin. It would take centuries for it to even begin to recover, but it would never regain its former glory. The psychological impact was just as profound. The belief in an eternal, divinely protected city was shattered. The world had changed, and the center of power had shifted violently. The story of the fall of Baghdad is a powerful and sobering reminder. It shows us how even the greatest civilizations can be fragile, how knowledge and culture can be lost in an instant, and how arrogance can lead to ruin. But it's also a story of resilience. Though the books were destroyed and the scholars were lost, the ideas that originated in Baghdad had already spread. The knowledge of algebra, medicine, and astronomy had traveled to Europe and beyond, planting the seeds for the Renaissance. The legacy of Baghdad did not die entirely in the waters of the Tigris. It lives on in the foundations of our modern world, a ghostly but powerful echo of a city that once shone brighter than any other. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the past. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to face an army that seemed to appear from nowhere? An army so disciplined, so swift, and so utterly terrifying that entire civilizations crumbled before it. Today, we're journeying back in time to the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia to uncover the story of the Mongols. Imagine a world of endless grasslands under a vast, open sky. This was the cradle of the Mongol people. For centuries, they were a collection of nomadic tribes, masters of the horse and the bow, constantly warring amongst themselves. But in the late 12th century, a man was born who would change everything. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. He was a visionary, a unifier, and a military genius. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer other tribes, he assimilated them. He broke down old tribal loyalties and forged a new identity, the Mongol nation. He created a society built on merit, discipline, and absolute loyalty to him. This wasn't just a collection of warriors anymore. It was a state on horseback, a nation on the move. The core of the Mongols' success was their army. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Every Mongol man was a soldier from birth. They could ride for days on end, sleeping in the saddle and drinking mare's milk. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering that could shoot arrows with lethal force over incredible distances. A single Mongol warrior could carry several bows and a quiver full of different types of arrows, each designed for a specific purpose, from piercing armor to signaling troops. But their real strength wasn't just in their individual skill. It was their organization and tactics. The army was structured on a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. This made command and control incredibly efficient. Orders could be relayed rapidly across a vast battlefield using a system of flags, horns, and signal arrows. This was a silent, deadly machine. Their battlefield tactics were a symphony of calculated chaos. They perfected the feigned retreat, a maneuver that preyed on the overconfidence of their enemies. A group of Mongol horsemen would charge, engage briefly, and then pretend to flee in disarray. Lured into a chase, the enemy would break formation, their heavy infantry and cavalry stretching out into a long, vulnerable line. And just when they thought victory was near, the trap would spring. Hidden reserves of Mongol cavalry would burst from the flanks in the rear, while the fleeing unit would turn and attack. The pursuing army would be encircled, trapped, and annihilated. It was a terrifyingly effective tactic that worked time and again. Before any campaign, the Mongols gathered extensive intelligence. Spies and merchants would map out cities, assess their defenses, identify sources of water, and gauge the political climate. They knew their enemy's strengths and weaknesses long before the first arrow was fired. This meticulous planning allowed them to move with a speed that defied belief. Mongol armies could cover 100 miles a day, a pace that was simply unimaginable to the more sedentary armies of Europe and the Middle East. They moved like a storm front, appearing on the horizon with little to no warning. Now, let's talk about the element that truly defined the Mongol conquests: fear. The Mongols weaponized psychology. Their reputation preceded them. When the Mongol horde approached a city, they offered a choice: surrender immediately, accept the Khan as your supreme ruler, pay the tribute, and you will be spared. Your city would become part of the empire, your artisans and engineers put to work, and your people allowed to live. But if you resisted, the consequences were unthinkable. If a city dared to defy them, the Mongol response was absolute and methodical. They were masters of siege warfare, employing captured engineers to build catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. They would divert rivers to flood cities or to cut off their water supply. And once the walls were breached, the real horror began. The policy was simple: total annihilation. The city would be razed to the ground, its buildings burned, its walls torn down so that nothing remained. The population was systematically massacred. Accounts from the time speak of mountains of skulls and rivers of blood. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated terror. The goal was to send a message to every other city and kingdom in their path. This is the price of resistance. The stories of slaughtered cities spread like wildfire, and soon, the mere rumor of a Mongol army approaching was enough to make rulers surrender without a fight. Fear was their most effective siege engine. After Genghis Khan's death, his empire didn't crumble. It expanded. His sons and grandsons continued the campaign of conquest, pushing west into Russia and Eastern Europe, and south into Persia and China. One of his most formidable grandsons was Hulagu Khan. In the mid-13th century, Hulagu led a massive army into the heart of the Islamic world. His most infamous campaign was the Siege of Baghdad in 1258. At the time, Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a beacon of culture, science, and learning for 500 years. It was home to the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries in the world. Hulagu demanded surrender. The Caliph, arrogant and complacent, refused. The siege that followed was a catastrophe. After the city fell, the Mongols unleashed a wave of destruction that is still remembered with horror. The city was plundered and burned for weeks. Estimates of the death toll ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. It is said that the waters of the Tigris River ran black with the ink of countless books thrown from the House of Wisdom, and then red with the blood of the city's scholars and citizens. The fall of Baghdad was a devastating blow to the Islamic Golden Age, a cultural cataclysm from which the region would take centuries to recover. From the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube River in Europe, the Mongols forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They connected east and west like never before, creating a period known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. Along the revitalized Silk Road, trade flourished. Goods, ideas, technologies and, unfortunately, diseases like the Black Death traveled freely across the continent. Gunpowder from China made its way to Europe. The printing press moved eastward, and cultures mingled in unprecedented ways. Yet, this empire, built on speed and terror, was not destined to last. It became too large to govern effectively. The descendants of Genghis Khan began to adopt the cultures of the people they had conquered. The empire fractured into several successor states, like the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. These Khanates eventually feuded with each other, and one by one, they declined and fell. The legacy of the Mongols is complex and often contradictory. They were ruthless conquerors who caused immense destruction and death, but they were also unifiers who created a period of relative peace and fostered incredible cultural exchange. They were a force of nature that erupted from the steppes, redrawing the map of the world and setting in motion changes that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The story of the Mongol Empire is a stark reminder of how a small group of determined people, united under a powerful vision, can change the world forever, for better and for worse. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of history, Asmos Epic Tales. See you next time. In the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was an unstoppable force, a tidal wave of conquest that had already reshaped Asia. Genghis Khan's grandsons were carving up the known world, and one of them, Hulagu Khan, was given a task of immense scale and historical significance: to march west and bring the lands of the Middle East under the Mongol banner. His primary objectives were to subdue the Lurs, a people in western Iran, to destroy the infamous Hashashin, the Order of Assassins, to secure the submission of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, to deal with the Ayyubid states in Syria, and finally, to confront the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Hulagu was the brother of the great Khan, Mangi, and he was given one of the largest Mongol armies ever assembled. Some historians estimate it was around 150,000 strong, a staggering number for the time. This wasn't just a raiding party. It was a mobile nation of warriors, engineers, families, and herds, a force designed for permanent conquest. They moved slowly but deliberately, a storm gathering on the horizon of the Islamic world. Before Hulagu even reached the heart of the Middle East, he made his intentions clear. His first major target was the Nizari-Ismaili state, better known as the Assassins. From their mountain fortresses like Alamet, they had terrorized the region for centuries. But against the overwhelming power and sophisticated siegecraft of the Mongols, their legendary strongholds fell one by one. By 1257, the power of the Assassins was broken, their Grand Master executed. One of Hulag's primary objectives was complete. Now, his gaze turned towards the grandest prize of all: Baghdad. Baghdad wasn't just any city. For 500 years, it had been the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the capital of the Abbasid. It was a city of scholars, poets, and scientists, home to the legendary House of Wisdom. It was the symbolic center of the Sunni Muslim world, presided over by the Caliph, Al-Mustasim Billah. While the Caliph's direct political power had waned over the centuries, his spiritual authority was immense. To many Muslims, he was the successor to the Prophet's uncle, a figure of supreme religious importance. This is where the story takes a tragic turn. Born from a fatal misunderstanding of the New World Order, Caliph al-Mustasim seems to have been trapped by his own legacy. He saw himself as occupying a position so sacred that no one would dare to challenge it. When Hulagu Khan sent envoys demanding submission, the Caliph responded with a mixture of arrogance and indecision. His replies to the Mongol ultimatum were evasive and, frankly, insulting. He reminded Hulagu that an attack on Baghdad would provoke the wrath of the entire Muslim world, from east to west. He boasted that divine power protected him and his city. He was, in essence, trying to use his spiritual authority as a shield against the most pragmatic and ruthless military machine on the planet. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Mongols, under their shamanistic and Tengarist beliefs, operated on a simple principle. Heaven, or Tengri, had granted them a mandate to rule the entire world. In TR's eyes, there was only one ruler under the sky, the Great Khan. Any other king, emperor, or caliph who refused to submit was, by definition, a rebel against the will of heaven. The sacred status of the caliph meant nothing to Hulagu. In fact, Al-Mustasim's defiance was seen as a direct challenge to the Mongols' divine right to rule. There could be only one response. As Hulag's massive army advanced, the caliph's court was paralyzed by infighting and delusion. His advisors were split. Some urged him to submit, pay tribute, and save the city. Others, more hawkish, advocated for resistance, believing in the strength of Baghdad's walls and the divine protection of the caliphate. Al-Mustasim wavered. He failed to mobilize his army effectively, which, though smaller than the Mongol force, was not insignificant. He failed to strengthen the city's defenses. He delayed negotiations, always believing that his unique position would somehow grant him a special outcome. In late 1257, the Mongol horde arrived at the gates of Baghdad. Hulag's army, a multi-ethnic force, including Christian contingents from Georgia and Armenia, encircled the city. Mongol engineers, many of them captured from China, set to work building siege engines and digging trenches. On January 29, 1258, the bombardment began. Catapults hurled massive stones against the walls, and the defenders, poorly led and outnumbered, were quickly overwhelmed. Witin Awik, The eastern wall was breached. The Caliph, finally realizing the hopelessness of his situation, tried to negotiate. He sent out envoys, but it was far too late. Hulagu was no longer interested in submission. He wanted unconditional surrender. On February 10th, Al-Mustasim, along with his sons and 3,000 of Baghdad's nobles and officials, emerged from the city and surrendered to the Mongol Khan. What happened next is one of the most infamous sacks in human history. Hulagu reportedly ordered the surrendered garrison to lay down their arms. On se dit, they were massacred. Then, on February 13th, the Mongol soldiers were unleashed upon the city itself. For 7 days, Baghdad was subjected to an orgy of destruction. The accounts from the time are horrifying. Citizens were slaughtered indiscriminately in the streets, in their homes, in their mosques. The great libraries, including the House of Wisdom, which held countless precious manuscripts on science, medicine, and philosophy, were destroyed. The books were either burned or, as one famous account tells it, thrown into the Tigris River. The story goes that the river ran black with the ink of the books and then red with the blood of the scholars. The grand mosques, palaces, and hospitals, the symbols of a golden age, were looted and burned to the ground. The city that had been the intellectual beacon of the world for half a millennium was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The death toll is impossible to know for sure, but contemporary estimates range from 200,000 to over 1 million people. The stench of death was so overwhelming that Hulagu had to move his camp upwind from the ruined city. And what of the Caliph, Al-Mustasim, who believed his sacred status would protect him? The Mongols had a taboo against spilling royal blood directly onto the earth, so they did not use a sword. Instead, Hulagu had the Caliph wrapped in a carpet and then trampled to death by horses. His sons were also executed, with the exception of one who was sent to Mongolia. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for 5 centuries, was extinguished in a single, brutal act. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 was a seismic event. It marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The political and cultural center of the Islamic world was shattered, and it would never fully recover its former glory. The destruction of the libraries represented an incalculable loss of human knowledge. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was profound, a deep trauma that reverberated for centuries. For Hulagu Khan, it was a stunning victory, cementing Mongol control over Mesopotamia and Persia. His campaign would continue westward into Syria, but the tide was about to turn. In 1260, at the Battle of Anjalut, a Mongol army would finally be defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt, halting their seemingly unstoppable advance. This battle would prove to be just as decisive as the fall of Baghdad, setting the western limit of the vast Mongol Empire. The story of Al-Mustasim and the fall of Baghdad is a tragic lesson in the clash of civilizations. It's a story of a leader who failed to understand the nature of his enemy, who placed his faith in tradition and sacred status in the face of a new and brutal form of power politics. The Mongols didn't play by the old rules. They were making new ones, written in blood and fire across the Eurasian continent. And in 1258, the glorious city of Baghdad learned this lesson in the most devastating way possible. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from the past. We'll see you in the next one. Have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? In the 13th century, that's exactly what played out. The unstoppable force was the Mongol Empire, and the supposedly immovable object was Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age. This wasn't just another battle. It was a clash of civilizations that would echo through history. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was a city of unparalleled wealth, knowledge, and culture. Its libraries held the wisdom of ages. Its markets buzzed with trade from across the known world, and its palaces were legendary. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was seen not just as a political leader, but as the spiritual head of Sunni Islam. To many, the idea of Baghdad falling was simply unthinkable. It was the center of their universe. But far to the east, a new power was rising, forged in the harsh steppes of Central Asia. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants, was expanding with breathtaking speed and terrifying efficiency. They were a military machine, unlike any the world had ever seen. Their horsemen were masters of maneuver and psychological warfare. Their siege engineers were ingenious, and their discipline was absolute. They had already conquered vast swaths of Asia and Eastern Europe, leaving a trail of shattered cities and humbled empires in their wake. The man leading the charge towards the Middle East was Hulagu Khan, a grandson of the great Genghis. He was ambitious, ruthless, and had a clear mission from his brother, the great Khan Mangay, to extend Mongol dominion all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean. Any who submitted would be spared. Any who resisted would be annihilated. It was a simple, brutal policy that had served the Mongols well. Before marching on Baghdad, Hulagu had methodically dismantled other powers in the region. He crushed the legendary assassins at their mountain fortress of Alamat, a feat many thought impossible. He subdued a host of smaller principalities, absorbing their soldiers and resources into his ever-growing army. By the time he turned his eyes toward Baghdad in 1257, he commanded a colossal force, perhaps one of the largest Mongol armies ever assembled. It was a diverse host, including not just Mongols, but also Chinese siege specialists, Armenian and Georgian Christian allies, and Persian troops. Hulagu sent an ultimatum to Caliph al-Mustasim. The terms were stark: dismantle Baghdad's walls, accept Mongol overlordship, and come to Hulagu in person to pay homage. Surrender, or face the consequences. Inside the magnificent walls of Baghdad, the Caliph's court was dangerously divided. Al-Mustasim himself was more interested in a life of leisure and luxury than in statecraft or military strategy. He was indecisive and heavily reliant on his advisors, who gave him conflicting counsel. One faction, led by his Grand Vizier, argued for appeasement. They pointed to the fate of other cities that had defied the Mongols and urged the Caliph to negotiate, to buy time, to do whatever it took to avoid a direct confrontation. They believed the Caliphate's treasury could buy their safety. Another, more hawkish faction, dismissed the Mongols as mere barbarians. They were full of misplaced confidence, believing in the sanctity of Baghdad and the spiritual authority of the Caliph. They boasted that the entire Muslim world would rise to defend its capital. If the Caliph just gives the order, they claimed, devout soldiers from east and west will flock to his banner. They fatally underestimated the speed, unity, and sheer destructive power of the Mongol war machine. Tragically, al-Mustasim chose the worst possible path, a mix of defiance and inaction. He sent back a response to Hulagu that was arrogant and dismissive, yet he failed to adequately prepare for war. He didn't mobilize a grand army, nor did he properly reinforce the city's defenses. He seemed to believe that his own religious status would be a shield, that the Mongols wouldn't dare to attack the commander of the faithful. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In late 1257, the trap began to close. Hulagu's army advanced on Baghdad from multiple directions, a vast sea of horsemen and siege engines. They were methodical. First, they systematically seized the surrounding farmlands, cutting off the city's food supply. Then, their engineers diverted parts of the canals, creating a swampy morass to hinder any potential breakout attempts by the city's defenders. The Mongol forces, under their best generals, set up camps on both the eastern and western banks of the Tigris River, completely encircling the great city. Baghdad, the vibrant hub of the world, was now an isolated island, completely cut off. The siege began in earnest on January 29, 1258. The sky over Baghdad was suddenly filled with the terrifying thud of Mongol siege engines. Catapults and trebuchets, built by skilled Chinese engineers, began to hurl massive rocks against the ancient walls. Showers of arrows, so thick they were said to block out the sun, rained down on the defenders. The noise was constant and deafening: the crash of stone, the war of arrows, and the war cries of the Mongol horde. The Caliph's army, though fighting bravely on their home ground, was hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. Their attempts to sally out and attack the besiegers were repulsed with heavy losses. The Mongol forces were disciplined, coordinated, and relentless. Within days, a section of the eastern wall was breached. Mongol warriors poured into the Ajami Tower, one of the key defensive positions. The fight for the walls was brutal and bloody, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Seeing the situation was hopeless, Caliph al-Mustasim, his resolve finally shattered. On February 10th, just under 2 weeks after the siege began, he tried to negotiate. He sent a delegation of the city's most prominent citizens to Hulagu, hoping for mercy. But it was too late. Hulagu, who had been insulted by the Caliph's earlier arrogance, was in no mood for terms. The time for negotiation had passed. Hulagu demanded the Caliph surrender unconditionally, accompanied by his sons and about 3,000 of Baghdad's notables, scholars, and officials. Al-Mustasim walked out of the city gates and gave himself up to the Mongol leader. They had hoped this act of submission would save their city and their lives. It was a fatal mistake. Hulagu ordered the Caliph's entire entourage to be executed on the spot. He then ordered the disarmed garrison of Baghdad to come out from the city. As they laid down their weapons, they too were massacred. With the Caliph captured and the army destroyed, Hulagu gave the order his soldiers were waiting for. On February 13, 1258, the Mongol army was unleashed upon Baghdad. What followed was one of the most horrific sacks in human history. For a full week, the city was subjected to an orgy of destruction. Soldiers swarmed through the streets, killing, looting, and burning. No one was spared. Men, women, and children were cut down in their homes and in the mosques where they sought refuge. The scale of the slaughter was unimaginable. Contemporary accounts, though likely exaggerated, speak of hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Tigris River was said to have run red with the blood of the slain. But the Mongols' destruction went beyond human life. They sought to erase Baghdad's very soul. The Grand Library of Baghdad, the legendary House of Wisdom, which contained countless precious manuscripts on science, medicine, philosophy, and literature from across the known world, was utterly destroyed. Its books were thrown into the Tigris. It is said that the ink from the manuscripts turned the river black. Palaces, mosques, hospitals, and schools' centuries of accumulated culture and learning were looted and burned to the ground. Baghdad, the city of 1,001 nights, was reduced to a smoking ruin. The fate of the Caliph himself was a grim final chapter. The Mongols had a superstition about spilling royal blood directly onto the earth. So, following this tradition, Al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet and then trampled to death by horses. With him died the 500-year-old Abbasid. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves across the world. In the Islamic world, it was a profound psychological blow. The city that had been the center of their civilization for half a millennium was gone. It marked the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age. The intellectual and cultural heart of the region had been ripped out, a loss from which it would take centuries to recover. For the Christian world in Europe and the Levant, the news was met with a mixture of shock and, in some quarters, grim satisfaction. The destruction of the Caliphate was seen by some as divine retribution and an opportunity for the Crusader states. The Mongol Empire, however, continued its westward march. After Baghdad, Hulug's forces pushed into Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. It seemed as though nothing could stop them. Their advance was only halted later in 1260 at the fateful Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, where they were defeated by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. That battle marked the high-water mark of the Mongol conquest in the Middle East. Today, the 1258 Siege of Baghdad stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization. It shows how quickly a center of immense wealth, power, and learning can be utterly destroyed. It's a story of hubris, miscalculation, and the devastating consequences of underestimating an opponent. The fall of Baghdad wasn't just the end of a city. It was the end of an era, a turning point that reshaped the course of history for the Middle East and the world. Thank you for watching. And if you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the past.